What if a broken soldier found not only the truth about his wife's death, but also the son he never knew existed? What if a loyal dog led him through storms, lies, and the darkness of human greed back to the light of love and home? This is the story of Ethan Miller, a weary veteran, and his faithful dog, Duke, whose courage uncovered a secret buried beneath loss, and whose hearts found a miracle waiting at the end of pain. A story of family redemption and the quiet power of faith that turns grief into grace. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this heartwarming journey. Before we begin, tell me where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The rain was steady and cold over the town of Maple Creek. The sky was low and gray, and the air smelled of wet leaves and rust. Drops of water fell from the branches of tall pine trees and gathered in dark puddles along the narrow road. It was a quiet morning, heavy with mist, the kind of silence that only came after long nights of rain. Ethan Miller lived in a small wooden house on the edge of the valley. The house was old, its porch slightly leaning, its roof patched in places that had seen too many winters. Inside, everything was simple, the kind of simplicity that came from someone who no longer expected much from the world. Ethan was 35 years old, once a Marine, now just a man trying to live quietly among the fading echoes of the past. His dark brown hair had begun to show threads of gray. His beard was short and rough, framing a face marked by years of hardship. His green eyes carried the look of someone who had seen too much and said too little. He wore a brown-yellow jacket, faded by time, and a pair of blue jeans that had long lost their color. His boots were old but strong, worn smooth by long walks across the muddy roads of Maple Creek. Every morning he dressed the same way, the uniform of a man who no longer cared about change. His hands were scarred, his palms calloused from the machines he fixed at the small repair shop near the creek. He had worked there since leaving the Marines, earning just enough to keep his life moving forward. Life after the war had been different. The world felt smaller, quieter, but also heavier. Ethan had lost his wife 2 years after returning home. Grace had been his reason to come back, and when she was gone, something inside him went silent. He had stopped talking much to anyone in town. People knew him as the quiet mechanic who always paid his bills and never joined them at the bar. His house had become both a shelter and a prison, a place where memories lingered more strongly than voices. His only companion was Duke, a German shepherd with thick golden black fur and sharp amber eyes. Duke was 5 years old, large and steady, with the proud posture of a trained service dog. He had been with Ethan since the day after Grace's funeral, when a friend from his old unit had brought the dog to him. At first, Ethan had not wanted him, but Duke had stayed, lying by the door, waiting every morning without demand. Slowly, his presence became the one steady thing in Ethan's life. The dog seemed to understand the silence, to sense the pain that words could not carry. When nightmares woke Ethan in the middle of the night, Duke would lift his head and rest it on his owner's knee, grounding him back into the world. That morning, the rain had not stopped. The sound of it filled every corner of the small cabin. Ethan sat at the table, staring at a half-empty cup of coffee gone cold. The ticking of an old wall clock counted each second like a slow heartbeat. He glanced at the window, where raindrops streamed down in long, uneven lines. Outside, the earth was soaked, the trees swaying in the wind. It was the anniversary of Grace's death. Ethan had not planned to visit her grave that day, but something in him changed when Duke came to sit by the door. The dog waited, tail still, eyes fixed on him, as if reminding him of something he could not ignore. Ethan sighed, pushed his chair back, and reached for his jacket. He stepped outside, and the cold rain met him instantly. It soaked through the sleeves of his jacket, but he did not care. He walked to the truck parked near the edge of the gravel path. Duke followed close behind, his fur darkened by the rain, paws leaving marks in the wet ground. They climbed into the truck, and Ethan started the engine. The old vehicle groaned before coming to life. The drive to Maple Creek Cemetery was short, maybe 10 minutes. The wipers pushed away the rain in slow, rhythmic arcs. The road curved through the woods and opened into a narrow hill where the cemetery sat. Wooden fences lined the perimeter, their paint chipped and faded. Rows of headstones rose from the wet grass, gray and silent. Ethan parked near the entrance, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment without moving. Finally, he opened the door. Duke jumped out first, landing softly on the wet ground. Together, they walked the familiar path between the stones. The air was cool and full of the scent of rain and pine. Water dripped from the trees, tapping softly against the graves. Ethan's boots sank slightly into the mud. He reached Grace's grave near the far end of the hill. The stone was clean, simple, and gray. The letters of her name were darkened by the rain. Ethan knelt down and rested his hand against the surface. He did not speak. He never did. The words were always there in his chest, but they never reached his lips. Duke lay beside him, his head low, tail resting still on the wet ground. The only sound was the steady rhythm of rain falling around them. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear Grace's voice again, soft and full of light. But when he opened his eyes, there was only the gray sky above him. Then Duke lifted his head. His ears twitched, and his body grew tense. Ethan followed his gaze. A few yards away, near a small cluster of headstones, a child was standing alone. It was a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, small and thin, wearing a light jacket that was soaked through from the rain. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his shoulders shook slightly as he cried. Ethan stood up slowly. The boy was facing a headstone, his hands pressed together as if he was speaking to someone. There was no one else in sight. No car near the gate, no umbrella, no adult nearby. The image unsettled Ethan. Duke looked up at him, waiting for a command, but Ethan said nothing. He took a few careful steps closer. The sound of his boots in the mud made the boy glance up. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The boy's eyes were dark brown, bright with tears. His face was pale and thin, his lips trembling. He looked frightened at first, then confused, as if unsure what to do. Ethan did not speak right away. He stopped a few feet away and looked down at the headstone in front of the boy. The boy did not say anything, just wiped his nose with the back of his hand. The rain had started again, light but cold. Duke walked a few steps ahead and stopped beside the boy. The dog sniffed the air and then sat down quietly, close enough to be near, but not to startle him. The boy reached out a small hand and touched the dog's head. Duke stayed still, his tail moving once in slow reassurance. Ethan stood watching the two of them. The boy's small hand rested on Duke's fur, and for the first time, the crying seemed to stop. The cemetery was silent again, except for the faint patter of rain. Ethan looked down at the boy, and something inside him shifted. The way the boy looked, the quiet sorrow in his face, felt painfully familiar. He did not know why, but his chest tightened. He had not felt that kind of ache in years. He looked once more at Grace's grave, then back at the child standing beside Duke. The air felt heavier now, filled with a strange unease. Duke looked up at him, as if sensing the same thing. Ethan did not understand it yet, but something about that moment felt like the beginning of a story that had been waiting for him all along. The boy stepped back from the grave, his head lowered, and started to walk slowly toward the path that led to the gate. Ethan watched him until the mist swallowed his small figure. Duke stayed still for a while, ears tilted forward, before turning to Ethan with a soft whine. Ethan reached down and patted his head. The dog's fur was cold and wet. They walked back to the truck together, silent except for the sound of their steps in the mud. As Ethan opened the door and looked back once more at the rows of gray stones, he felt something he could not explain, a pull deep in his chest. He started the engine. The truck moved slowly down the road, leaving the cemetery behind, while the rain kept falling over Maple Creek. The morning fog hung low over Maple Creek. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a thin mist that drifted through the tall trees and along the quiet streets. The sky was pale and heavy, and the earth still smelled of wet grass and pine. The world was silent except for the soft drip of water from the leaves. Ethan Miller stood by Grace's grave, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. His brown-yellow jacket was darkened by the rain, his jeans heavy with moisture. Duke stood beside him, alert but calm, tail lowered, his fur glistening with tiny droplets. The air felt colder now, though the storm had passed. Ethan's eyes followed the boy, who still stood only a few steps away, small and fragile against the gray backdrop of the cemetery. The boy's thin frame trembled, as if the cold had settled deep inside him. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his hands hung by his sides, clenched tightly. Ethan hesitated. He had not spoken to anyone new in months, and words no longer came easily to him. Yet something about the child held him in place. Duke took a slow step forward, his nose twitching. Ethan's voice came out low and quiet as he asked if the boy was lost. The boy lifted his head slowly, revealing a face pale from cold and tears. His brown eyes shimmered, and his small lips quivered as if he wanted to speak, but could not. He shook his head, then looked back toward the grave in front of him. Ethan's gaze followed. The stone was small, the kind made for someone who had not lived long. There were no flowers, only damp earth, and a thin ribbon tied around a wooden cross that leaned slightly. The sight made Ethan's chest tighten. He knew grief when he saw it. The boy's shoulders trembled again, and Ethan wanted to comfort him, but did not know how. Duke whined softly, a low sound that broke the silence. The boy turned to look at him, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, then a hint of warmth. He reached out one trembling hand and touched Duke's head. The dog stayed still, eyes gentle. The small connection seemed to steady the child. Before Ethan could say more, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He turned to see a man walking through the mist with slow, measured steps. The man carried a black umbrella, the fabric shining faintly in the dull light. His dark coat was long, tailored, and perfectly dry despite the wet ground. He appeared to be in his early 50s, tall and lean with sharp shoulders and a precise posture. His hair was silver gray, neatly combed back, and his clean-shaven face was pale and narrow. His eyes were a cold shade of blue-gray, steady but distant, as if nothing around him could disturb his calm. The man's shoes barely made a sound as he approached. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and controlled, the tone of someone who expected to be listened to. "There you are," he said to the boy, his words even and gentle. "You should not wander off like that." He rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy stiffened, his small body tensing under the man's touch. Ethan straightened slowly. The stranger turned his gaze toward him. The man's smile was polite but empty, the kind of smile practiced in front of a mirror. "I hope he was not bothering you," the man said. "The boy has had a difficult week. I am his guardian. My name is Richard Hale." Ethan nodded once, still studying him. Richard Hale looked like someone who belonged in boardrooms rather than cemeteries. His clothes were too clean, his movements too precise. Even the way he held the umbrella seemed deliberate, as though nothing in his world happened by accident. Ethan introduced himself simply, his voice rough. Richard's expression remained calm. He looked down at the boy, his tone soft but firm. "Come along, Michael. We should get back before it rains again." The boy hesitated and glanced once more at Duke, then at Ethan. His eyes lingered for a moment, deep and brown, the same quiet warmth that Grace's eyes once held when she looked at him across their kitchen table. The resemblance struck Ethan with sudden force, leaving him momentarily breathless. Duke let out a low growl, not loud enough to be threatening, but enough to break the man's composure for a second. Richard's eyes flickered down to the dog, and his smile tightened. "Fine animal," he said smoothly, though his voice carried a faint edge. "You should keep him on a leash. Cemeteries are not the place for surprises." Ethan reached down and rested a hand on Duke's neck. The dog calmed, though his eyes stayed fixed on the man. Richard turned away, guiding the boy gently but firmly by the shoulder. They began to walk toward the gate at the far end of the cemetery. The mist seemed to close around them as they went, their figures growing smaller. The boy looked back one last time, meeting Ethan's gaze. There was something in that look, uncertainty, fear, or maybe a silent plea, but then it was gone. The rain began to fall again, thin and cold. Ethan stood where he was for a long time. Duke pressed against his leg, sensing his unease. Ethan rubbed the dog's fur absently, his mind circling the strange encounter. He told himself it was nothing, just a moment between strangers. Yet the feeling in his chest refused to fade. That child's face, those brown eyes, they were hauntingly familiar. He remembered the softness in Grace's gaze, the way her eyes seemed to hold both light and sorrow. The memory rose so vividly, it made his throat ache. He looked back at Grace's grave. Water streamed down the headstone, blurring the letters. He knelt again and placed a hand against the cold stone. For a moment, he closed his eyes. The weight in his chest grew heavier, a quiet ache that spread through his body like the rain soaking into the soil. He had learned to live with silence, with the loneliness that came after loss. But now something inside him stirred again. It felt like the first breath after holding it too long. Duke shifted beside him, ears twitching toward the sound of distant footsteps, but there was no one else left in the cemetery. Only the sound of the rain and the whisper of wind through the grass. Ethan took a deep breath and stood up. His jacket clung to his shoulders, heavy with water. He turned toward the truck and began walking slowly down the path. Duke followed close beside him, his tail low, Steps quiet. The drive home was silent. The wipers moved back and forth across the windshield, clearing the steady drizzle. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the boy's face. He tried to push it away, telling himself it meant nothing. But each time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image: the dark eyes, the trembling lips, the look that reminded him so much of Grace that it hurt to breathe. When he reached his cabin, the light had already begun to fade. The forest outside was quiet except for the sound of rain dripping from the eaves. Ethan parked the truck and sat for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel. Duke shifted beside him, waiting patiently. Ethan finally opened the door, stepping out into the damp evening air. The house looked smaller than usual, the windows dim. Inside, the silence felt thicker, heavier than before. He removed his jacket, hung it on the hook by the door, and sat down at the kitchen table. His coffee mug from the morning still sat there untouched. The air smelled faintly of oil and rain. Duke lay down near the door, his head resting on his paws. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared at the wooden floor. His mind kept returning to the same question, though he could not explain why. Why had the boy's eyes looked so familiar? He rubbed his hands together, feeling the calluses along his palms. It had been years since he allowed himself to feel anything deeply. Yet today, something inside him had cracked open. He did not know what it meant, and maybe he did not want to. Still, as the night settled over Maple Creek, Ethan found himself glancing toward the window again and again, as if expecting to see those brown eyes looking back from the dark. Outside, the rain began again, steady and soft. Duke lifted his head, listening, then lowered it once more with a quiet sigh. Ethan whispered softly to himself, words that disappeared into the sound of the rain. I saw her eyes. The words felt strange in his mouth, heavy and unreal. But deep inside, he knew they were true. The night in Maple Creek was silent except for the sound of wind brushing against the windows. The air was cool and damp after the afternoon rain. A thin fog drifted low through the forest and clung to the walls of Ethan Miller's small cabin. Inside, the faint crackle of the fireplace was the only sound that kept the darkness from swallowing the room. Ethan sat on the old wooden chair near the hearth. His jacket hung on a hook by the door, and the smell of wet leather lingered faintly in the air. The dim light from the fire moved across his face, revealing the sharp lines that years of hardship had carved into his skin. His short brown hair was slightly messy, a few strands streaked with gray, though he was only 35. His beard was short, the kind that comes from long days without caring much for appearances. He looked older than his years, not from time, but from the weight of everything he had carried. Duke lay near the fireplace, his large frame stretched across the wooden floor. His thick coat shimmered with shades of tan and black, his eyes half closed but alert. He was 6 years old, a strong German shepherd whose loyalty ran deeper than instinct. The bond between man and dog had become silent yet unbreakable, forged through years of loss and survival. Duke often watched Ethan with quiet understanding, as if he could read the unspoken thoughts that haunted him. That night, Ethan could not rest. His mind returned again and again to the boy at the cemetery, to the haunting image of those brown eyes that mirrored Grace. He had spent the evening pacing the room, pouring coffee he did not drink, staring at nothing in particular. Now he sat still, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly, staring at the floor, as if the answers might be buried somewhere beneath it. He whispered softly, "Grace, what have you left behind?" The words felt heavy, pulled from a place deeper than memory. Duke lifted his head at the sound of his name, ears twitching, eyes focused. He let out a low rumble from his chest, not of warning, but attention. Ethan turned to him. "What is it, boy?" Duke rose and padded across the room, his claws clicking softly on the old wooden planks. He stopped near the corner where the floor met the stone wall, the same spot where Grace used to keep a small bookshelf. The shelf was gone now, taken down months after her death, when Ethan could no longer stand to see her books untouched. Duke sniffed at the floor, then began to scratch lightly with one paw. Ethan frowned. He stood and walked over, the boards creaking under his weight. Duke scratched again, then looked back at Ethan and whined softly. "What are you doing, boy? There is nothing there." He crouched beside the dog and placed his hand on the floor. The wood felt uneven. He pressed down on one plank, and it moved slightly. His breath caught. The board was loose. He hesitated, a strange unease curling in his stomach. The cabin had been built decades ago, its floorboards worn and scarred, but this one felt different, as if someone had once lifted it and put it back carefully. He reached for the small tool set by the wall, took a flat screwdriver, and gently pried the board upward. It came free with a faint creak of old nails. Beneath the plank was a small hollow space no larger than a shoebox. Inside lay a wooden box, dark with age and smooth at the corners. It was simple, carved from walnut, the kind Grace would have loved. Ethan stared at it for a long moment before reaching down. The box was cool to the touch and heavier than it looked. He lifted it out slowly and set it on the floor beside him. Duke sniffed it once, then sat back on his haunches as if waiting for Ethan to open it. Ethan brushed a thin layer of dust from the lid. His heart beat faster. Grace had been gone for years, and he had thought he had found everything she left behind. Letters, sketches, small notes she used to leave on the refrigerator. But this felt different. This was deliberate. A secret meant to be found only by him. He hesitated, his hand resting on the lid. For a moment, the memories came rushing back, the laughter. The mornings filled with her humming as she made coffee. The evenings when she painted by the window while Duke slept at her feet. The ache in his chest deepened, and he whispered her name again, his voice almost breaking. Then he opened the box. Inside lay two objects. The first was a folded piece of paper, yellowed slightly at the edges. The second was a small photograph, black and white, its surface smooth and glossy. Ethan reached for the photo first. As soon as he turned it toward the light, the air seemed to leave his lungs. It was an ultrasound image. The shape was faint but unmistakable. A child. Grace Miller's name was printed at the top in small faded letters, along with a date from more than 5 years ago. Ethan stared, unable to move. His mind refused to make sense of what his eyes saw. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Grace could not have been pregnant. The doctors had said so. They had tried for years, facing disappointment after disappointment, until finally the hope itself had died. He remembered her tears, the quiet nights when she said it was enough just to have him and Duke. And now this. He pressed the photo to his chest, eyes closed. 100 thoughts collided in his head. Confusion, disbelief, guilt. Had she been afraid to tell him? Had she known something he did not? He forced himself to breathe, to look again at the box. There was still the folded paper. He picked it up and unfolded it carefully. It was not a letter, but a small envelope. Inside was a single metal key with a tag attached. The tag read, Henderson Bank, Safe Deposit 27A, under the name Grace Miller. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the key over in his palm. The brass was worn smooth from touch, as though it had been handled often before being hidden away. Ethan sat there for a long time, staring at the objects on the floor. The faint crackle of the fire seemed far away. Duke lay quietly beside him, eyes following his every movement. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his voice a whisper barely audible. "Why would you hide this, Grace? What were you protecting?" He leaned back against the wall, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. The thought of Grace keeping something so monumental from him felt like a wound reopening. Yet beneath the pain was something else stirring a fragile thread of hope he had not felt in years. If the ultrasound was real, if Grace had been pregnant, then maybe the boy he saw at the cemetery was not a stranger after all. His heart pounded harder at the thought. He looked at the photo again, the small, shadowy outline frozen in time. The dates matched the year before her accident. He had been away on a short job in another county that spring. Could she have hidden this then? Had she gone to the bank to store it before he returned? He closed his eyes and tried to recall her expression in those final weeks, the distance in her gaze, the way she sometimes smiled as if holding a secret too precious to share. Ethan stayed on the floor for what felt like hours. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Duke shifted closer, resting his head on Ethan's knee. Ethan absently rubbed the dog's fur, his hand steady despite the storm in his chest. He whispered softly, "It was never just grief, was it, boy? She left something behind for us to find." Duke looked up at him, with eyes that seemed almost human in their understanding. The night deepened, and the wind outside grew stronger. Ethan placed the photo and key back into the box, closed the lid, and set it gently on the table. He would go to the bank in the morning. He did not know what waited there, but he knew now that Grace had not simply vanished into memory. She had left a trail, and he was finally ready to follow it. He stood and looked toward the window. The fog outside was lifting, revealing the faint outline of the trees. Somewhere out there in the darkness lay the truth. Ethan reached down and scratched Duke's head. "Good boy," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we find out what she wanted us to know." Duke wagged his tail, once then settled down again, near the hearth, as Ethan turned off the light. The fire died slowly, leaving behind only the soft orange glow of embers. The cabin fell silent. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir beneath the weight of his sorrow. Not peace, not yet, but purpose. The morning light was dim over Maple Creek. A thin layer of frost covered the ground, and the trees stood still under a pale sky. The air smelled faintly of cold earth and wood smoke. It was the kind of morning when sound traveled slowly, as if the world was still waking. Ethan Miller stood beside his truck, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, watching his breath fade in the air. Duke sat near his feet, tail brushing the gravel, alert and patient. The key from the box hung heavy in Ethan's pocket, its weight pressing against his thoughts. He drove into town with the slow rumble of the old truck echoing across empty streets. Maple Creek was quiet that early in the day. Small shops were still closed, their windows fogged from the cold. The bank stood near the end of Main Street, a brick building with faded letters that read Henderson Bank. Ethan parked across the street and sat for a moment. His reflection in the windshield looked older than he remembered. He rubbed his jaw, the rough stubble scraping against his palm, then reached for the key. Inside, the bank was warm and smelled faintly of paper and polish. A woman at the front desk looked up and greeted him with a polite smile. She was in her late 40s, with dark hair pinned neatly and the calm expression of someone who had spent years behind that counter. Her name tag read Linda. Ethan explained that he had come to access a safe deposit box under the name Grace Miller. The woman nodded and checked her records, her fingers tapping softly on the keyboard. She looked up again and said the box was still active. Her tone carried mild surprise, perhaps because so much time had passed. A few minutes later, Ethan followed her through a narrow hallway that led to the vault. The walls were thick, the air colder here. Rows of small metal doors lined the room, each one identical except for the numbers etched into their faces. Linda handed him a clipboard to sign, then gave him a set of gloves and a private key. Her smile was kind but distant, the way strangers smile when they sense grief. Ethan found box 27A and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The door opened slowly, revealing a metal tray that he carried to the small viewing room. Linda left him alone. Duke waited outside the building, sitting by the door, calm as always. Ethan set the tray on the table and stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, dark brown and worn at the edges. Beneath it lay a sealed envelope. The sight of Grace's handwriting on the front made his throat tighten. He sat down, the chair creaking under his weight, and opened the journal first. The pages smelled faintly of ink and lavender. Her handwriting was smooth and slanted, the same way she used to sign her paintings. The first pages were filled with small sketches and short notes about daily life. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. Grace had written about fear. About someone named Richard Hale, the director of an organization called Haven Circle. Ethan frowned. He had never heard of it, but the name stirred a faint memory he could not place. Grace wrote that Hale had once helped her with a charity project, promising donations to an art program for children. She had trusted him at first, but later began to feel uneasy. He had learned things about her life, her marriage, and finally her pregnancy. She had tried to keep it secret, but somehow he had found out. Ethan read each line carefully, his chest tightening. Grace wrote that Hale had come to their house one evening when Ethan was away. He had spoken softly, but his words carried a threat. She wrote that he told her there were people who would not want the child to be born, that she should stay quiet for her own safety. Grace had been terrified. She did not tell Ethan because she feared he would confront Hale and endanger himself. Instead, she planned to leave Maple Creek and take the baby somewhere safe. The last entries grew more frantic, her writing trembling as if written in haste. She mentioned packing bags, hiding documents, and making arrangements to leave. Then the words stopped. Ethan sat frozen. The sound of his heartbeat filled the small room. He turned the last page and found a loose sheet tucked inside the back cover. It was the letter. His hand shook as he unfolded it. "My love, if you ever read this, it means I failed to reach the place I hoped for. You must not blame yourself. I hid everything because I wanted to protect you. I knew what Richard was capable of. He wanted something from me, something I could not give. When he found out I was pregnant, he said the child could not exist. I thought I could escape before he found me again. If you ever find the key, it means you are strong enough to know the truth. Please forgive me. I loved you more than my own life. Find him. Keep him safe. Grace. The letter ended there. The ink had bled slightly in places, as if it had been written through tears. Ethan held it for a long time. His breath came unevenly, and his chest felt tight, as though the air itself had turned heavy. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the silence pressing against his ears. He thought of Richard Hale, the man he had met at the cemetery. The smooth voice, the perfect smile, the way the boy's shoulders tensed under his hand. Every detail now felt different. The name Haven Circle echoed in his mind like a warning. He felt anger rise in his chest, sharp and hot, but beneath it was grief so deep it almost broke him. Grace had faced that fear alone. While he was away, fixing machines and trying to rebuild their life, she had carried this burden in silence. He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes. He could almost see her, standing in their kitchen, smiling through worry, hiding pain behind soft words. He pressed the letter to his forehead, whispering her name. Grace. For the first time in years, tears filled his eyes. He had thought he had nothing left to lose, but now he realized he had lost far more than he ever knew. After a while, he placed the letter and the journal back into the tray. He locked the box again and signed the release form with steady hands. Linda asked politely if everything was all right. He nodded, but could not speak. She gave him a quiet look of sympathy, the kind reserved for those who carried invisible wounds. Outside, Duke rose from where he had been waiting. The dog wagged his tail once and nudged Ethan's hand as if to ask what had happened. Ethan knelt beside him and rubbed his head. "We have work to do, boy," he said softly. His voice was low but certain. Duke looked up, his amber eyes steady and full of trust. Ethan walked back to the truck, the journal tucked safely inside his jacket. The cold wind bit at his face as he opened the door. He started the engine and sat there for a while, staring through the windshield at the quiet town. Somewhere out there, Richard Hale lived behind his polished smile and his lies. Ethan knew now that Hale was not just a man from the cemetery. He was the shadow that had destroyed Grace's peace. As the truck rolled away from Main Street, the clouds above began to darken. The road stretched ahead, slick from melting frost. Duke rested his head on Ethan's arm, sensing the shift in his mood. Ethan's eyes were fixed forward, steady and hard. The grief was still there, but beneath it, something stronger had begun to grow. It was purpose. He whispered under his breath, barely audible over the hum of the engine. "I will find out what you did to her." The sound of the wind rose as they left the town behind. Maple Creek faded into mist once more. Ethan did not look back. The truth had found him, and now he was ready to face whatever waited next. The afternoon sky over Maple Creek was pale and windless. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and cold metal, and the clouds drifted low over the horizon. Ethan Miller stood by his truck outside the cabin, the journal and letter of grace spread open across the hood. Duke sat beside him, his dark fur shimmering faintly in the light, his amber eyes following every movement of Ethan's hands. The silence of the forest around them was thick, broken only by the soft rustle of branches. Ethan had not slept since reading Grace's words. Her fear, her plea, the truth about Richard Hale echoed through his mind like a bell that would not stop ringing. He felt the same hollow ache that had followed him through every mission during the war. The feeling of standing at the edge of something that could change everything. But this time, the battle was personal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old phone, one he had not used in years. The screen flickered weakly before lighting up. He scrolled through the contacts until he found a name that had not appeared in his thoughts for a long time. Jake Barnes. Jake had been his brother in arms. They had served together in the Marines for nearly a decade. Jake had been a technician, a quiet genius who could take apart any system and rebuild it better than before. After the service, Jake had turned to private work, using his skills in cybersecurity to help veterans protect their small businesses. But Ethan knew that under that calm surface, Jake had kept one foot in the shadow world of intelligence. Ethan pressed call. The phone rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. Ethan Miller. That a ghost? Or have you finally remembered I exist? Ethan exhaled slowly. I need your help, Jake. There was a pause. The tone on the other end changed. The easy humor faded. Jake asked what happened. Ethan told him everything. About Grace. About the boy. About the man named Richard Hale and the organization called Haven Circle. He spoke in short sentences, each one heavier than the last. There was a long silence when he finished. Finally, Jake spoke again. You are telling me a registered charity is tied to something darker. Do you have proof? Not yet, Ethan said. But I have her journal. And her letter. She wrote his name before she died. Jake's voice lowered. Send me everything you have. Give me a few hours. I will see what the system says about Haven Circle. Ethan ended the call and looked down at Duke. The dog tilted his head slightly, as if listening to words that had not been spoken. Ethan reached down to pat his head. We are not done yet, boy. The sun began to set behind the trees, turning the frost on the grass to a dull shimmer. Inside the cabin, Ethan sat by the table, the faint light from the lamp casting long shadows. Duke lay near the door, ears twitching. Ethan waited, time stretching thin. He thought about Grace's handwriting, the fear in her last words, the boy's eyes. The weight in his chest grew until he could hardly breathe. The phone finally buzzed. Jake's message read, short and cold. We need to talk. Video link. Now. Ethan opened his laptop. Its screen cracked at the corner from years of use. The connection flickered, then steadied. Jake appeared on the screen. He was about 40, tall and broad-shouldered, with short blonde hair and sharp blue eyes. His face was rough, marked with faint scars from old burns, the kind that spoke of a past lived close to danger. He wore a faded gray hoodie, and behind him was a room filled with monitors glowing in the dim light. You were right, Ethan. Haven Circle is not what it seems. Jake's voice was steady, but his expression had hardened. The organization lists dozens of charity fronts, all linked to wealthy donors. But several of the addresses lead to empty buildings or shell companies. He leaned closer to the camera. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. They moved children through private medical programs and fake adoption services. Money, names, identities, all altered. Ethan felt his stomach twist. He had seen horrors in war, but nothing like this. And Richard Hale. Jake nodded. I traced him through multiple entities. He is the founder and main executor for Haven Circle's trust fund. The man owns properties in 3 states under different names. If your wife was involved with him, she saw something she should not have. Ethan stared at the screen, his jaw tight. He wanted to punch through the table, to destroy something, but he stayed still. The image of Grace's handwriting flickered in his mind again, her words about fear. Jake watched him silently. Finally, he said, "There is more. I think I found the record of a boy, about 8 years old, listed under the name Evan Hale. The documents were sealed 6 years ago. The adoption file came through Haven Circle. The birth certificate has the same date as the ultrasound photo you sent me." Ethan froze. The room went silent. He looked down, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His throat felt tight. He whispered, "He is mine." Jake did not answer right away. Then he said quietly, "It looks that way." The screen flickered as Jake pulled up more data. "I can get you their current address, but you cannot just walk in there. These people are protected. You need evidence, something solid that links them to trafficking." Ethan straightened. "Then we get it." Jake leaned back in his chair, a faint smile touching his face. "You sound like the man I remember. I will send you everything you need. There is a facility on the edge of town registered under Haven Circle Foundation. That is where they keep their files, cameras, guards, the works." Ethan nodded slowly. He glanced at Duke, who had risen to his feet, eyes fixed on the door. The dog seemed to sense the change in the air. Ethan felt the old instincts return, the same calm before a mission. The years had dulled his body, but not his purpose. "We go tonight," Ethan said quietly. Jake sighed. "You never did know how to wait." "Fine, I will. Guide you through the systems remotely. Get in, get proof, and get out." The connection ended. Ethan closed the laptop and stood. His reflection in the window looked hard and unfamiliar. He put on his jacket, the brown-yellow one that had followed him through storms and years. Duke stood ready by the door, tail still, eyes sharp. Ethan looked down at him. "Grace wanted to protect me, boy, but now we protect what she left behind." Duke gave a soft bark, low and sure. Ethan stepped out into the night. The air was cold enough to sting, and the forest stretched dark and endless before him. He climbed into the truck, Duke jumping in beside him. As the engine started, the headlights cut through the mist. The road ahead led toward the Haven Circle facility. He drove in silence, his mind steady. The time for grief was over. What waited ahead was truth and justice. The night sky over the forest near Asheville was dark and heavy with mist. The air was cold enough to bite through Ethan Miller's jacket, and every sound carried too far in the stillness. The moon hid behind clouds, giving only a faint silver glow to the trees. The dirt road beneath his boots was slick with dew, and the headlights of his truck were off. He cut the engine and let silence settle. Ethan sat for a moment, breath slow and steady. The building stood ahead, gray and square behind the trees, with iron fences and a guard post at the gate. A few lights glowed in the upper windows, and a low electrical hum drifted through the air. Duke sat beside him in the passenger seat, muscles tense, eyes focused forward. The dog's fur caught a trace of light, and his ears twitched at every small sound from the woods. Ethan looked at his hands on the wheel. They were steady and cold. It had been years since he moved like this, quiet and deliberate. The instincts returned the way old drills come back in the dark, but this time it was not for duty. It was for Grace. It was for the child she had tried to protect. He brushed a hand across Duke's neck and spoke low and calm. "You know what to do, boy, just like we practiced." Duke exhaled softly, and his tail flicked once. Ethan stepped out. boots finding soft earth. The trees muffled his movement as he slipped through the shadows. His brown-yellow jacket blended with the dark trunks, and his jeans were damp with dew. Duke followed close, then slipped away at a signal, a gray shadow dissolving into the brush. Ethan reached the fence and crouched behind bushes. Two guards walked a slow circuit, one near the front and one by the loading dock. Their flashlights cut lazy arcs. When the nearer guard turned the corner, Ethan moved. He climbed the fence and dropped silent inside. From the opposite side of the compound, a sharp bark rang out, then another. Voices rose. A beam of light swung toward the sound. Both guards started away at a jog. The side path was clear. "Good work, Duke," Ethan whispered. He ran along the wall and found a loose window latch. The frame shifted with a tired scrape. He slid through into a storage room that smelled of chemicals and dust. Shelves held boxes marked medical supplies and records. The hallway beyond was quiet except for the sigh of air vents. A red camera light blinked near the ceiling. Jake had sent a crude blueprint and timings. Ethan waited for the lens to turn, counted, then crossed the gap and moved into the main corridor. Hale's office was at the far end. The nameplate caught a sliver of light. Ethan turned the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the air was warm and still. Papers were aligned. A single lamp cast a pool of yellow across a polished desk. Certificates and photographs filled the walls. In every picture, Richard Hale smiled, with careful control, silver hair, neat, hand in the grip of donors and officials. Cold anger rose in Ethan's chest. He sat at the computer and slid in the small drive Jake had given him. Code pulsed across the screen in quick lines, then vanished into the dark as files copied. Ethan opened a drawer. Locked. He wedged a screwdriver under the lip and twisted. The catch popped. Folders were labeled with names and dates. He turned pages with careful hands. Evan Hale. He stopped. He opened the folder. Inside were medical forms, legal documents, and photographs. The boy had the same brown eyes Ethan had seen at the cemetery. The birth date matched the ultrasound. Ethan's breath caught. He spoke so softly, it was almost no sound. "My son." The words on the pages were cold. Transfer logs, care locations, donor approvals. He felt his hands curl. He forced them flat and took pictures of every page, one by one, the phone clicking softly. A door slammed far down the hall. Footsteps. Ethan put the pages back in order and closed the drawer. He tapped the screen. The copy finished. He pulled the drive and killed the lamp. Darkness folded over the room. Two guards passed the door, radios whispering. Ethan waited, counting, then eased into the hall. He moved with the rhythm of the vents, crossing when the camera turned. The storage window gaped like a dark mouth. He climbed through and landed on wet grass. Duke emerged from the trees, chest rising fast, eyes bright and steady. Ethan rubbed the dog's neck. "Good job, buddy. Time to go." Shouts rose from the far side. The broken lock had been found. Ethan and Duke sprinted for the fence. The ground was slick and cold. He vaulted, dropped, and ran for the truck. The engine caught. Headlights cut through mist. Behind them, the alarm woke, a metallic wail rolling across the trees. The tires spun and then bit. The road narrowed into black tunnels of pine. The building fell away behind them and vanished. Ethan's heart pounded, but his hands were calm on the wheel. Duke sat high, watching the line of gravel unfold. In Ethan's jacket pocket, the drive and the photos pressed against his ribs. Proof. He breathed out, fogging the glass. Far off, The glow of Asheville softened the horizon. He spoke not as a prayer, but as a promise. We found him grace. I will bring him home. The morning sky over Asheville was pale gray, and a thin mist blurred the courthouse walls. The street was quiet except for the low hum of news vans along the curb. Ethan Miller stood at the base of the courthouse steps with the collar of his brown-yellow jacket turned up against the wind. Duke sat beside him, calm and steady, with golden black fur that caught the faint light. The dog's breath showed white in the cold, and his eyes stayed on Ethan. Inside the halls smelled of paper and coffee. Reporters murmured behind ropes, and cameras flashed in slow bursts. Ethan moved forward with measured steps, and his boots echoed on the marble. His face looked drawn from long nights, but his eyes were steady with the calm of someone who has survived too much. Jake Barnes waited near the courtroom door with a firm and sympathetic look. He was broad-shouldered, with blonde hair brushed back and blue eyes sharp from little sleep. Tension rode in his stance like a weight he refused to show. 2 nights earlier, they had handed everything to the FBI, the flash drive, the photos, and the files on Haven Circle. The agents took over. Agent Parker led the case. He was tall with dark skin, short hair, and a thin scar under his left eye. His voice was even and careful, and the eyes behind his glasses held a cold resolve. He had seen cases like this, but this one left a mark. When the agents raided the facility, they found what Ethan had uncovered, and more ledgers, false adoption records, and encrypted financial transfers that tied Richard Hale to a network across several states. The morning after the news ran across the country. Richard Hale, the polished man of charity, was in handcuffs. Now Ethan stood in court and waited for the session to begin. His palms were damp, though the room felt cool. Murmurs rose behind him as Hale entered with his lawyers. The man looked smaller than before. The confident mask had drained from his face. His silver hair was neat, but his eyes moved in quick, nervous cuts. Ethan watched him without a word. The trial opened. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, the files, the witness accounts, the photographs. Jake testified about the encrypted transfers and how they linked to the illegal network. Ethan listened in silence with his gaze fixed ahead. Each word lifted a weight, and yet each one carried pain. Grace's journal was admitted. The courtroom grew still as the prosecutor read passages in which her careful hand described fear and pressure from Hale. Ethan closed his eyes for a breath and steadied himself against the tide of memory. When the judge called Ethan to the stand, the room fell quiet. He rose with slow, deliberate movements and took his seat. He swore the oath in a low voice. His hands trembled once and then were still on his knees. The prosecutor asked him to recount what happened, how he found the box, how he read the letter, and how he reached the truth about Hale. Ethan spoke plainly, with a rough, steady voice. He told them about the years after the war, the day Grace died the storm over the cemetery, the boy who cried by her grave, and the way Duke barked in the rain. He described the night he went into the facility and how the folder with the boy's name matched the date from the ultrasound. He did not add flourish. He let the facts stand. The defense pressed him and asked whether he had broken the law by entering private property. Ethan kept his eyes level. "I did what any father would do," he said in a quiet tone. "I found proof that my wife was harmed and that my son was taken. You may call it what you like. I call it love." Silence followed. Even the defense attorney paused, and the next question did not come at once. The judge watched with a thoughtful, firm gaze. The hours that followed passed like a hard march. Agents presented the last pieces. The financial records showed years of manipulation and hidden trade under a false cover of charity. One by one, the lies that built Haven Circle fell away. When it ended, Ethan sat in a small waiting room outside the court. Duke rested his head on Ethan's boot, with eyes half closed and alert. Jake stood near the window and looked out at the street below. The verdict would come soon, yet the battle inside Ethan had already grown quiet. He thought of Grace again and of her letter. He heard the words that carried him through fear and exhaustion. Find him. Bring him home. The door opened. Agent Parker stepped in, and his voice was even but softer. "It is done," he said. "The jury found him guilty on all counts. Richard Hale will not see the light of day again." Ethan looked up with a tight jaw and clear, wet eyes. He nodded once and said thank you. Jake turned from the window. The usual dry humor in him was gone, and something solemn took its place. "You did it, brother. You brought her peace." Ethan stood and reached down to touch Duke's head. The dog wagged his tail once, as if to mark the change in the room. Together, they walked out into the pale afternoon. The air felt lighter, though the chill still clung to his skin. Reporters called across the street, but he did not respond. He opened the truck door, and Duke jumped in with the ease of long habit. For the first time in years, Ethan let himself breathe to the bottom of his lungs. The pain would not vanish, but it no longer owned him. He started the engine and looked once at the courthouse steps. In his mind, Grace stood there in sunlight with the same soft, proud smile he spoke in a whisper, meant only for the space between them. "Grace, it is done. I found him. I brought him home." Duke rested his head on Ethan's arm as the truck rolled away from the city. The sun broke through the gray, and a quiet beam spread across the road ahead. The afternoon sun hung low over Asheville and spread soft light across the quiet streets. The air was cool, but no longer heavy with winter. Trees along the sidewalk swayed gently, and the bare branches held the first signs of green. Inside a modest brick building that served as the social center, the faint hum of conversation and the distant sound of a clock ticking filled the warm room. Ethan Miller sat on a wooden bench near the window, with his hands folded loosely, and the light falling across the worn fabric of his brown-yellow jacket. His eyes were calm now, though faint shadows still lingered beneath them as reminders of nights that had stretched too long. A door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside. She was in her mid-40s and tall, with auburn hair tied neatly at the back and glasses low on her nose. Her name was Karen Woods, and she was a coordinator at the social center. Her voice carried both firmness and kindness that came from years of working with difficult cases and broken families. She smiled softly at Ethan as she approached. "The boy is ready to see you." Ethan stood slowly. His heart began to beat harder, and each pulse echoed through his chest. For a month he had waited for this moment and counted days between disbelief and hope. Duke lay by his feet, and the old German shepherd was steady and silent. His fur gleamed under the warm light, and his amber eyes watched Ethan with quiet understanding. Karen led them through a narrow hallway, lined with drawings taped to the walls. Crayon suns and small houses with crooked lines filled the space with simple joy. At the end of the hall was a small room, painted in soft blue. Ethan hesitated at the door. He heard the faint shuffle of feet inside and a quiet voice humming to itself. When he stepped in, the world held its breath. The room was small and full of window light. A boy sat on the floor near a table of wooden toys. His hair was soft brown, and his eyes were a warm hazel like the eyes of Grace. He looked up at the sound of the door, and for a moment neither of them moved. Ethan's throat tightened. Every part of him wanted to move forward, yet his steps felt anchored by the weight of the years between them. Karen's voice came gentle from behind. "Evan, this is Ethan." The boy blinked, and his small hands tightened around a wooden car. Duke gave a low sound and stepped forward first. His tail moved slowly, and his body stayed low and patient. The boy watched with curiosity and doubt until Duke reached him and stopped. The dog waited. Evan lifted a small hand and touched the thick fur on Duke's neck. The warmth under his fingers broke something open. Tears welled in his eyes before he could stop them. Ethan knelt beside them, and his knees pressed into the soft carpet. His voice came rough and quiet. "It is all right. You are safe now." The boy looked up, with his face streaked by tears, and something deep in Ethan's chest shifted. The distance between grief and peace closed in that instant. Evan leaned forward, and his small hands clutched the fabric of Ethan's jacket. Ethan pulled him close. The boy's sobs came freely then, and trembled, as if releasing every fear he had held inside. Karen turned away to give them space. Duke circled once and lay beside them, and he rested his head near the boy's leg. The moment stretched in silence and held only the sound of breathing and the soft hum of the world outside. When the tears slowed, Evan spoke softly, without looking up. "Did my mom know you?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Yes. She loved you very much. She wanted you to be safe." The boy nodded and kept his hand on Duke's fur. "I dreamed of her sometimes. She was painting." She smiled. Ethan felt a tear slide down his cheek, though his voice stayed calm. "She used to paint in the morning. She would have liked this light." Karen returned with a folder and gave Ethan a small nod. Everything was finalized that morning. The papers were signed, and the case was closed. The boy was free to leave with him. Ethan thanked her quietly, and no other words were needed. Outside, the sky was deep gold. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth. They walked toward the truck near the curb. Evan sat close beside Duke, and his hand stayed buried in the thick fur. The dog turned his head and brushed the boy's arm with his nose, as if to make sure he was still there. The road back to Maple Creek stretched long and familiar. The trees rose tall on either side, and the mountains stood pale blue in the distance. Ethan drove in silence, and his hand was steady on the wheel. He glanced at Evan, who had fallen asleep with his head resting against Duke's side. The dog kept still, with slow, even breaths, and his gaze fixed on the passing horizon. When they reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the hills. The old house stood quiet, and its boards glowed in the orange light. The porch steps creaked as they climbed. The air smelled like pine and rain. Evan blinked awake as Ethan opened the door. Inside the home felt different now. The tools on the wall, and the old photographs, and the faint scent of oil and cedar had once been part of a life lived alone. Now the rooms felt like something waiting to be rebuilt. Ethan showed Evan the small room that had been a studio. Dust clung to the corners, but light spilled across the easel that had belonged to Grace. A half-finished painting rested there and showed a field of gold beneath a blue sky. Ethan watched the boy step forward and touch the frame gently. "She made this," Ethan said. The boy nodded. "It is beautiful." Later, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ethan and Evan sat on the porch. Duke lay at their feet with his head lifted toward the fading light. The grass swayed below, and the last touch of sun turned it gold. Evan laughed when Duke nudged his hand with a paw, as if asking for more attention. The sound of that laugh filled the air like the first song of spring. Ethan watched them, and a small smile formed at the corner of his lips. The ache in his heart was still there, but it no longer felt hollow. It had become something alive now and carried memory and peace together. He looked up at the sky painted in red and amber, and he whispered to the quiet air, "We made it home, Grace." As the light faded, the sound of Evan's laughter mixed with the soft rustle of leaves. The house behind them glowed warm. Duke stretched lazily, and his tail brushed against Ethan's boot. The world felt simple again. It was not perfect and not unbroken, but it was enough. Under the golden evening sky, father, son, and the loyal dog sat together. And for the first time in a long time, the air over Maple Creek carried only the sound of peace. Under the last light of evening, the world around Maple Creek grew quiet. The house that once stood as a place of sorrow now glowed like a beacon of warmth. Ethan sat back on the porch and watched Evan chase Duke across the yard. Their laughter rose into the air and faded into the soft wind that carried the scent of pine and spring rain. He looked at the horizon, and for the first time, he felt peace settle deep inside his chest. This was more than the end of a story. It was a reminder that even in the darkest valleys, love can find a path through. Pain had carved Ethan into a man of quiet strength, and that same pain had taught him to believe again. What he thought was loss had become the road that led him home. Sometimes, miracles do not come as flashes of light, but as small acts of faith, a step taken when everything seems broken. Each life carries its storms, but behind every cloud, there waits a dawn. Grace's final wish had not only saved a child, but had rebuilt a family. And maybe that is the message for us all, that love endures beyond time, and that hope is never wasted. If you believe that kindness can still change a life, share this story so others may find courage too. Leave a comment for those who need to hear that miracles are still real. Subscribe for more stories of faith and love. And may God bless you and your home with peace, understanding, and the light to keep going when days feel heavy. Because sometimes the smallest act of compassion is the very miracle someone has been praying for.